Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining me once again for this edition of Sandy Hook Hoaxers Debunked, brought to you by NewtownPostExaminer.com and SandyHookStalkers.wordpress.com. I'm your host, Keith Johnson, and today we continue our review of Insanemedia's video entitled Sandy Hook Debunking the Debunkers. And this video, of course, was put together by Sandy Hook Hoaxer, Swan, a.k.a. Swansong, a.k.a. Craven S. Moorhead. He's got a lot of AKAs there, folks. And a couple days ago, I threw this video together to address the major flaws in his arguments, particularly the false claim that the FBI reported 0 deaths in Newtown for 2012. And shortly thereafter, Craven responded with this comment. As you can see, he has nothing to say in his defense, just another off-color remark and a suggestion that I may be losing steam. And all I can say to that is if I sound fatigued, it has nothing to do with this fight, but rather the treacherous weather that has besieged us in this part of the country. So in addition to putting together debunking videos, I'm also dealing with intermittent power outages and pulling out 2 of my vehicles that have both slid off the road into ditches on 2 separate occasions. 4 times altogether, and believe me, folks, that is not fun. It's like walking on an ice cube. Getting back to Craven's video, today we tackle the second issue he raises, which is identification of the deceased. This is my part 2. And for that, he references my video entitled Wolfgang Halbig, A Picture Will Not Suffice. Now, here's the funny thing, ladies and gentlemen. Craven claims to be debunking my video, but ends up agreeing with pretty much everything that I lay out. I mean, first of all, you have to understand that the purpose of this video was to prove that Halbig hasn't got a clue about what he's talking about. This had very little to do with Sandy Hook and more to do with the fact that Halbig is lying about his experience and that the experience he does have is minor and completely out of date. And I pretty much spell that out right here in the description of the video. Halbig was claiming that pictures aren't used for identification of the deceased, and I proved that that was simply not true. This was all about Halbig. It was the second in the series of what I have dubbed a Wolf Watch. I mean, how much clearer do I have to be? Nevertheless, Craven comes along with a debunking video on yours truly, and here's what he has to say in that very video.
It may surprise you at this point to find out that I actually happen to agree with this self-important, condescending hack. Life is not like the movies or like television, and in many cases, if not most cases, identification of deceased persons are carried out in the manners in which he has described, either through photograph or on a monitor through video. And if you think about it, it makes a certain amount of sense. Viewing a deceased loved one would be a deeply emotional experience, not necessarily one that a coroner's staff would be trained to handle. And you can imagine how difficult it might be if it actually came to a point where a family member had to be physically removed from the proximity of their loved one. So viewing through photograph or through video makes a great deal of sense. Now, I will not presume to speak for Mr. Halbig. I can only assume that his experiences as a law enforcement officer have been different, and that's all I'll say about that.
Okay, so far, as you can see, we don't have much of a debunking video going on here. But there's more. You see, he goes off into a completely different direction than where I was going in my video, and says that the debate about whether or not photographs were used in the identification process at Sandy Hook is mute, because according to his research,
not one family member that I have been able to find identified their own deceased loved one. And now I'm going to prove it to you.
Okay, well, fair enough, Craven. That's a whole different issue entirely. You want to dig into that? Fine, let's do it. Make your case, but please don't call this a debunking of my video on Halbig, okay? Now, the next several minutes of his video, I really don't have much of a dispute with because he's actually reading from the final report, and I suggest you watch his video so you can get a full understanding of his argument. He goes over several documents, which I'm showing here. Only thing I did is highlight the dates and times because it's important to note when these actions were taken. And most of these documents he shares describe how troopers collected photos and other identifying information from surviving family members and other sources to assist the medical examiner in identifying the deceased. And this took place roughly from mid-afternoon to early mid-evening on December 14th. Okay, so Craven does a lot of reading from these documents with a lot of voice inflection, and then sums it all up with this.
I am telling you, I have not found one example of any family member personally identifying any victim in any way. All identifications were carried out by law enforcement personnel or the coroner's office. Look, I know this is starting to drag on, but really in my mind, this is without precedent. I am unaware of this situation occurring anywhere else, and if you are, by all means, please let me know.
Okay, well, Craven, you extended the invitation, and I have accepted. I'm stepping up to the plate to let you know. First of all, just to get this straight, you're basically agreeing with me that it's not uncommon for photos to be used in the identification process, but you're saying that even photos weren't used at Sandy Hook. And that, you say, is unprecedented. In other words, it's an anomaly. It's outside the norm that parents would not identify their children either in person or by photograph prior to those bodies being sent to the mortuary or funeral home. Okay, so if I was to prove that it's not unusual, which I intend to do today, I know what some of you are going to say. You're going to say, Keith, even if that's true, Chief Medical Examiner Wayne Carver has made your argument problematic because he claims that parents were shown photographs as a means of identifying the slain children. Did he? I mean, really? Actually, if we go by that very familiar press conference, it was a reporter who asked this question. And Carver's reply at that press conference was not a definitive statement that the photos taken by his photographers were used to identify the deceased. And that's all that I'm pointing out, just that fact, not trying to read into his statement or speculate in any way. You check out the press conference for yourself and come up to your own determination.
We did not bring the bodies and the families into contact. We took pictures of them, of their facial features. You have it's easier on the families when you do that. There is a time and a place for up close and personal in the grieving process. But to accomplish this, we felt it would be best to do it this way, and you can sort of you can control the situation depending on your photographer, and I have very good photographers.
Okay, now back to Craven Swan's argument here. As I was doing research, I came across this absolutely must-read book published in 2011 entitled Mass Casualties, Managing the Community Response. And on page 257, I found a protocol that seems to mirror what happened at Sandy Hook. It says here, the medical examiner collects documentation, including ante-mortem documentation gathered from the families, which is compared and evaluated by the medical examiner to determine identification of the remains. Upon determining positive identification, the medical examiner should direct that formal notification of death be provided to the next of kin. So you see, identification is determined by the medical examiner based on information provided by the families, at least according to this book. Now, for those unfamiliar, as admittedly I was, this is what ante-mortem data is. And here's a definition of death notification. Note that the next of kin is being told that the deceased has already been identified. Now, my personal interpretation of all this is insignificant, so I went directly to the source. I contacted the author of the aforementioned book, Mr. Peter Teahen. That is him, and that's his website or the book that I mentioned. Mr. Teahen is an author, licensed funeral director, mental health professional, and disaster responder. He has years of professional community and volunteer experience. His service contributions include pioneering community projects, lecturing, developing mental health crisis management intervention programs, and lending his skills to the development of disaster operation protocols, as well as extensive volunteerism in disaster services. Folks, I would invite you to check out Mr. Teahen's website, Peter Teahen, Teahen.com. Look at this resume. Author of Mass Fatalities, International Mass Fatality Center. He's the founder and president of that. Look at this. Consultant Project Haiti, Medical Response, Haiti Earthquake 2010. This is what you call an impressive resume. This, ladies and gentlemen, is an expert. And what follows now is my interview with Mr. Teahen, and I've edited out the first portion, which is just a lot of introductory stuff. I start out where I present the scenario that Craven or Swan, however you want to refer to him, sets forth in his video. It's based on the documents he shared, and also from a similar experience that was related to me by one of the Sandy Hook parents. So I'm going to let this run all the way through with no additional commentary from me, and this will end the program. Thank you very much.
With the Sandy Hook elementary school shootings, those parents were visited by state troopers who collected photographs and other identifying information from them, and that was how the medical examiner determined the identity. And it was at the funeral home where the parents first laid eyes on their deceased child. So in other words, in some cases, and correct me if I'm wrong, in some cases, the only role that a parent might have in the identification process is providing photographs and other antemortem kind of information so the medical examiner himself could establish positive identification.
Well,
Is that correct?
It'd be photograph, it'd be DNA samples, dental records, sometimes latent prints like footprints, handprints, things like that. What the difference between, sometimes, you watch, as you say in the CSI shows, it's a gunshot wound, single hole somewhere in the body that kills a person. When you're looking at a mass fatality event, usually you're talking about remains that are severely traumatized. And so you have oftentimes two things. One is when you have a large number of deaths, depending on the number of deaths, you have 150, 200, 300 deaths. There's just not the capacity of bringing a family in to look at, to find one out of all those. That's a small detail. This bigger detail is usually in mass fatality, you're talking about bodies that have been severely traumatized. They may not have a face anymore. They may not be intact. They may have, like I think we referred to in the book that you have a two-seater jet aircraft that flies into the ground. You may have 1,100 body parts, human remain fragmentations. So, there's nothing to visually see. You've got, so you may have, we would recognize a loved one usually by, looking at the face or something. And, if it's been exposed to extreme charring from fires, crushing from injuries, there's not going to be anything for families to really view that would be a good image that you'd want them to view. You also, because of the multiple fragmentations, that's where DNA comes into. So it depends on the conditions of the remains. It's if they're basically, the medical examiner is doing the legal identification through dental records and usually through 2 or 3 different ways, more than just visual. They're using 2 or 3 different ways where, they're matching up with medical records and DNA samples. If from a funeral director view, I would rather have my loved one taken over to the funeral home, cleaned up, blood removed, restored where, if there's any crushing or disfigurations going on, to see my loved one, that has been fixed up, rather than seeing somebody that, is so bloody and so horrific looking that that's the imprint I'm going to have on my mind. And so, and there are many times where, you see in these, a lot of times in foreign situations where they have the remains just laid out, and that's the way the U.S. used to do it years and years ago. They'll have body after body after body, and the families go down and, and say, that's mine. But there's been a history of so many misidentifications doing it that way, because of the trauma, the injuries and our minds tend to block out the image, and we see what we want to see.
Right.
There was a classic case here in Iowa where there were, and this was several years ago, where two teenage girls, approximately same weight, same height. They were they were high school girls, and they were in a motor vehicle accident. And the one family identified their daughter and went ahead and buried her. The other sat by a hospital bed for 2 weeks with their daughter, hoping that she would survive. And when she came out, because of the trauma that both of them went through, they saw what they wanted to see. And it wasn't only until after a couple of weeks later that the family, when the gal recovered in the hospital, where she came out of the coma, that family realized it wasn't their daughter, and that actually the girl that the other family buried was their daughter, and this gal in the hospital bed was the family, the other family. So, even standing in hospital beds with your loved one alive, sometimes because of the swelling, discoloration, disfiguration, you can't tell, and so you can't afford those type of misidentifications, and that's why legally you've got to figure out how do we ensure we have a positive identification. And so if you remove the CISI image, where these people are totally intact and they have a bullet hole, those are the easy ones. And in mass fatalities, the trauma of those type of deaths usually lead to massive disfiguration, bad condition of the remains that you've got to be totally accurate before you relieve it back to a family member. Because if I give you one misidentification, then that means there's someone else I misidentified. You never have one misidentification. It's always two, because if you've mislabeled this person, then you've mislabeled someone else. And once you've done that, then you've undermined the integrity of the entire identification process, because then, if you misidentified my daughter, then how about that person's daughter? Then maybe you misidentified my son, and then it just, that's additional trauma that you want to avoid inflicting on the family members.
Right, exactly. Now, the only real mass casualty shooting that I've really looked at closely was, like I said earlier, the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. And this is how the medical examiner handled it. They had a mobile morgue out in the parking lot, and the bodies were brought out from the school to that mobile morgue. And the medical examiner sent out state troopers to the various parents within hours, like early in the afternoon and early in the evening, or I'm sorry, late in the afternoon, early in the evening. And they asked the parents for identifying information like photographs and this antemortem information. And the medical examiner made the identification based on that. So what it appears, and then he sent out, after he was able to make identification based on the photographs that were given to him, then troopers went back out and they did the death notification. So the parents, the first time they really laid eyes, it was not on a photograph, was not through personal identification, but was at the morgue. So is that, would you find that unusual that the first time that they laid eyes on their deceased child was at the mortuary or the funeral home, and that they didn't identify it through pictures? You see what I'm saying?
No, I mean, no, I wouldn't find. I mean, in an airplane crash or anything else, they don't see the remains until they're sent over to the funeral home. That's pretty standard.
Yeah. Okay.
And a picture,
find that unusual.
It wouldn't, because if you show me a picture of what your loved one looked like and they don't have a face anymore, then how are you comparing it?
Right.
If the injuries of that incident cause such massive damage to that person,
right?
When you're in a controlled environment of the school children, the parents pretty much knew what the clothing was on them. They knew, there were probably some other physical characteristics,
right?
And it is. I would imagine that scene was so horrific, that it took time to move the children, and you've got limited facilities. Most I don't know what their medical facilities were. They probably didn't have a large morgue at a hospital or something to take all those children. You know,
right.
so
Yeah.
you know, and it's, you know, that's a crime scene, and so
Mm-hmm.
you know, they couldn't bring the families out to the crime scene because they have to control, because every piece of evidence that is, you know, that they had to accumulate collect off those remains were going to be used, you know, to, you know, eventually prosecute the person in court. Now this person was killed, but you know, they, you know, but it's still a crime scene. It has to handle it as a crime scene until many days later, until they collect all the information. And they have to figure out sometimes, not necessarily with the children, but you know, who died first, what, you know, were they killed instantly? Did they suffer for a long time before they die? All that, and that's what the medical examiner can determine by examining the bodies. And that then builds into a criminal case against the shooter or shooters that would help in the prosecution. So they have to be so careful that they garner the correct information, that they do the most positive identification. And it would not have served any benefit for the families to come out to the shooting site or to come out over to a hospital morgue and seeing their loved one, their child, in a, you know, bloodied and damaged by the weaponry that was used in that event. And so, you know, and there's been many cases, and I don't know the viewability rate of those children, but, you know, that's a role of the funeral director, where they can go in and they can clean the body up, they can restore the person, they can oftentimes make the person look as though, you know, they have not been traumatized by the incident. You know, that's a far better image for those families to cope with than to see a child whose head's been half removed by the weapon.
Right. Exactly. So
if you bring the children out to a morgue and let them identify them, they're going to see a child with half their face gone, where if you get them to the funeral home can restore that and make it more palatable to the families.
Right. So, yeah, because I've looked on a lot of websites for coroner's offices, and they say that in most cases that visual identification by the next of kin is not even done, either by photograph or by personal viewing, and they always recommend that the first viewing of the deceased be at the mortuary or the funeral home. So that seems to be standard, correct? Yeah.
Well, that's pretty standard. I mean, you know, there are, you know, no one wants to go to a morgue. Nobody wants to go to a medical examiner's office. You know, you know, there are sights, there's smells, there's images. You know, it's not designed for the living. It's designed to care for the dead. So you know, the families don't need to be exposed to that, and most coroners, most medical examiners will not use visual identification. I mean, you can even in aviation disasters, there's plenty where you have, you know, someone in a uniform that may have their clothes, you know, that may have their name on the clothes. You can't legally accept that as being that person,
right?
Because there's been plenty of situations where, you know, you and I were traveling together and you spilled something on your clothes and at breakfast that morning, so I gave you one of my shirts. I mean, as bizarre as that sounds, you know, if we went off of that, you need more legal proof that that's that person, because estates are involved, insurance is involved, you know, property settlements are involved to make sure you have the proper ID. And you don't ever want to say, well, we just looked at the image, and then, you know, I have pictures that I use in my training where a person from an accident scene, and you look at the two pictures and you think, well, they're the same person, but in reality, they're two different people.
Right.
And you know, and it's, you know, you just can't afford it, and that's why they have to use scientific methods, either, like I said, either DNA, latent prints, you know, dental records. For the most part, I think most people are identified through probably 95% through dental records, because you get the records from your dentist, and you know you've got a match as long as the jaws are intact. But if if the head is separated from the rest of the remains, then you'll use other means, piercings, tattoos, markings on the body, birthmarks, whatever, DNA then to make sure you have the, surgical implants. Did they have some type of corrective process done? That's, you need other methods, and you always have at least two forms of identification before you identify a person. So even if you have the dental records, what's the other characteristics that backs that up that there's no mistake here? And visual is the least accurate form of identification. Unless the body is just dropped over dead, no injuries, no swelling, no bruising, that type of thing. You drop over dead of a heart attack, then it's real easy. Or you get shot by one bullet hole and you're on CSI, and the bullet hole is in your chest. That's real easy. But once you get disfiguration of the face, then you're psychologically your mind tends to block horrific images, and you'll see kind of what you want to see, and that's why it's so unreliable.
Right. So that would be like, for instance, with children, which they don't have much of a footprint, other than perhaps some dental records and some other medical. So that it would make sense why the medical examiner, he's got, let's say, 20 dead bodies in front of him. He's never laid eyes on these individuals before. So it makes sense that he would send people out, whether it be his own death investigators or troopers, to collect information from the families, whether it be, photographs or dental records. And then the medical examiner himself, based upon that, would be able to determine which child is which based on their expertise. Then looking, real good. Wow.
And they're going to, it's like, the law enforcement, the medical examiner is part of law enforcement. And so it would be appropriate to send a law enforcement officer out to the home because, A, the family knows this is a legitimate person. I mean, they've just had their lives ripped apart. You can't send somebody out in a suit and tie and say, we need this. They'll send, because it is a crime scene that's being investigated, and you're talking chain of evidence, and the importance of being accurate. I mean, the most, other than the loss of their child, which was horrific beyond any measures, and the way it happened, that the only thing that could possibly have made that worse if they gave him back the wrong child. And then, and so everyone, you always have to make sure, that you're giving back the loved one that they want, because they deserve the best care possible that officials can give them, and so you try to get it back quickly, but you try to get it back. You have to give it back accurately. There isn't you can't go back and say, "Whoops, we're sorry. We need this body back. We gave you the wrong one." That's just, that's almost unconscionable. And so but there's a lot of ways, identify, people. But like I said, probably 90-some% are with dental records. If they don't have dental records, then you look at DNA. But DNA is getting faster, but DNA takes a little bit longer than to run a DNA match and to make sure you have an accurate. And in some cases of death, not necessarily in that shooting, some cases of death, the tissue, you can't take DNA samples because of contamination with jet fuel and other factors that would give you error in readings. So dental record still is the best, most reliable.
Great. Wow.
If this was your loved one, if these people were your friends, can you imagine how horrific that would have complicated it if they had gotten their wrong daughter or son child back?
Exactly.
They had been traumatized on top of what they were already traumatized, and it would open up all the other families saying, well, then maybe we have our one, and then your mind starts playing and say, well, then maybe our child is still alive somewhere. Where's our baby? We want, she must be alive somewhere if this isn't ours. And you've got that, and then you've got, then legally you'd have a lot of lawsuits looking at you because, the emotional trauma would be involved. So, and that's why the principle in the book and principle I write and lecture and teach with is the most important part of a disaster are the victims and the families. And they always are staying number one, and you do whatever you can to protect them and to serve them with the utmost integrity and moral guides that you can, because they become the number one focus in any disaster. And their safety, their care is in your hands. You try to do what is utmost right.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, I appreciate this time that you've given me, and what you said there as far as the families, they want to have the right of remembrance of their loved ones, and I can see why in many cases that they don't release gruesome photographs of children being slaughtered on the internet. I mean, are you opposed to that?
Purpose. It serves no purpose. I mean, what purpose does a show, whether it's adult or a child, to release graphic images like that? That shows disrespect to the deceased, and whose loved one are you going to show? I mean, are you going to show? Do you want your child? Do you want your wife? Do you want your parents or your brothers and sisters' gruesome photos posted on the internet?
Yeah, that's just disgusting. Yeah,
right. And so I mean, it's bad enough when you go on the internet and watch a Jordanian pilot, burning to death on the internet. If you were the mother and the father of that Jordanian pilot, what would you think?
Oh yeah, definitely.
And so why would you want to post gruesome pictures on the internet? And that's those gruesome pictures don't represent who that person was. Right. And it also entices or empowers another person with mental illness or other horrific intents to see what kind of, what can I do to get my pictures of my victims on the internet. Right. And so, you're just enticing other people to do horrific things.